Hi, this is Amber, and I honed in on the language. One of the things that I wanted to focus on was the different types of words and phrases that we might be using in our spaces to try to clearly lay out expectations, mitigate harm, and hopefully create spaces where participants can feel seen, heard, and vulnerable enough to do their best work. So, where I started was this goal. Our goal is to create spaces where everyone has the opportunity to feel brave and be their authentic selves. We acknowledge that this might look different from space to space and group to group. We encourage developing a universal language so that we all, as theater makers, can begin to change the culture of our theater world. This includes holding ourselves and others accountable, setting clear expectations, honoring boundaries, and meeting people where they are at with no judgment. And then I also wanted to highlight the importance of establishing the language, which I put here, and this one you can read for yourself. From there, I really began to focus in on the words that felt like they needed the most clarification, as well as ones that might be used throughout our document. Here's how I broke down my section. Concepts, where I discuss the words, possibly a definition if applicable, how we potentially use the words in our spaces, challenges to using these words, either because they might be misunderstood or because it's a change from what might be more mainstream, and taking it further, which could include suggestions and possibly a high-level overview of tools and activities that could be used. One of my favorite resources for this whole section that I used was the incredible article by Laura Ricard and Amanda Rose Villarreal that talked about safe spaces, brave spaces, and spaces of acceptable risk. Highly recommend if you're interested. Moving on from concepts, I wanted to include how we use the language to create our best spaces. So Alyssa and I created this section on clear communication and tools for that, such as exercises, activities, documentation, and team meetings. We plan to expand this section more and probably move it to its own section. And now I'm passing it on to Brian Grow.
To better understand how the polyvagal theory is applied in theater, I'll begin by describing the three states that provide a neural platform. First is ventral vagal state, social engagement or safety. Second, sympathetic state, mobilization or activation, and also sometimes called fight or flight. Third, dorsal vagal state, immobilization or collapse, sometimes referred to as freeze. These responses aren't voluntary. Our nervous system picks up information in the environment and evaluates the information on a subconscious level, not a cognitive, but a neurobiological level where we are picking up features of risk or danger. These risks or dangers can be real or perceived and will have the same effect on the nervous system. The nervous system cannot distinguish between what the mind only believes is real and what is real. Rehearsal processes often live in the duplicitous state of high-stakes imaginary circumstances capable of activating both sympathetic and dorsal vagal states while presenting the problem of optimum performance capacity existing in the ventral vagal state. Theatrical creation in the rehearsal process lives in a sort of dual consciousness of deep, meaningful connection and experience for theater practitioners, even while the imaginary circumstances of the play or production have the potential to be activating or dysregulatory in their nature. In order to get back to safety when theater practitioners are activated or hyper-aroused, it begins with awareness. Becoming aware of physiological cues of each of the polyvagal states and becoming fluent in the language of those cues. And then regulation, incorporating somatic practices, mindfulness, mind-body exercises, and traditional yoga practices, among other practices. A non-comprehensive list of some regulatory exercises or practices that we have found useful are Glimmer Menu, Windows of Tolerance, Routes to Safety, Traditional Yoga Practices, Fitzmaurice Voice Work, Somatic Practices, Meditation, and Consent-Based Practices.
The goal of the first rehearsal is to build the foundation of the rehearsal and production process and to inform your cast, crew, and all those involved of important things so everyone is on the same page as you move through the process. Things to consider going over during the first rehearsal. A lot of things that this will include will be discussed in more detail in other sections of the document and presentation. This is an overview of the things to consider as you're planning the first rehearsal. Use the first rehearsal for ensemble building versus doing a read through is something to consider. It is difficult for people to come into a place and immediately feel it is acceptable to take risks. Taking the time to build the ensemble may help individuals come together and be a part of the ensemble and/or company, and therefore more likely to take risks. Ensemble games are a lighthearted way to possibly begin this process. When looking at which ensemble games to use, consider games with various levels of risk so you can meet and support the people in the room where they are. Doing this instead of a read-through in the first rehearsal may give the cast a chance to make bigger choices on the first read-through. You can choose maybe a second or third rehearsal to do a read-through or other options for that read-through versus it being on the first rehearsal. Joining these games can help people in the room see that you're willing to take the risks that you're asking of them, which may put them in a more comfortable place and begin creating the acceptable risk space. Other things to consider discussing is common language that will be used, themes and topics of the show, resources, what's available and where they're located, and introductions of cast and crew. This is another chance also to maybe use some icebreaker games to help that ensemble. Introduce access needs. You could model them by using your own. Community agreements. This can be a collaboration of agreements between that group. Expectations. This is more from an executive lens, so that norms and expectations are very clear throughout the process. Concerns response path, so that everybody knows that path. These are things to consider going over. There are a lot of things to go over during the first rehearsal, so making a priority list for your company might be helpful. Creating a script or an outline may also be helpful to have the most efficiency with the time in your first rehearsal.
What's up, you guys? I'm Allie Bray, and I'm here to talk to you about the goal of creating trauma-informed rehearsal practices. When we enter our rehearsal spaces as theater artists, we bring with us our bodies, our histories, and our traumas. Healing trauma does not occur in isolation, but rather through relationships and in community, especially if we can establish repeatable and predictable practices for beginning and ending rehearsals to cultivate a sense of structure to give our ensemble something to count on and help them feel supported. Focus on the power of the creative process rather than the final product. Devising a scaffolded framework allows for growth at every level, helping people develop their artistic abilities wherever they're at, and perhaps even find healing through the creative collaborative process. Each collaborator is encouraged to prioritize self-care with the ability to opt out and take a break at any time. Cultivating curiosity and compassion in brave and supportive spaces allows learning and creativity to flourish. Let's continue. Here is an overview example of a potential trauma-informed rehearsal schedule. Begin with personal check-ins, move on to group warm-ups, then to the main activity / scene work, and closing. Some things you might want to consider including in your check-in practice include inviting people to share their access needs, offering a landing or grounding practice, and clapping or tapping into the rehearsal space together as a group. Here are some examples of warm-ups that increase group connection. In creating a relaxing, inclusive, secure environment, we want to honor people's boundaries by inviting them to modify warm-up exercises according to what and where they're at today. Moving on to the main activity/scene work. Here are some practices you may consider using in your rehearsals. You may want to start your scene work by reading the script aloud together, ensuring that the ensemble are literally on the same page. This gives the opportunity to discuss themes and questions relevant to the scene. If there's going to be any touch, regardless of whether or not there's an intimacy moment, make sure to include a boundary practice for your actors. And make sure to stay on track for scheduled breaks, which may include the option for a gentle stretch. If you clapped in, make sure to book in the work session by clapping or tapping out, followed by a group or individual de-rolling exercise. Make sure to leave space for reflections to recapitulate the day's work, as well as time for questions, clarifications, and end by informing your team about what's next on the horizon. Thank you, and now I'll pass the mic over to Alyssa.
Hi everyone, this is Alyssa, and I focused on consent, boundaries, and intimacy work for the stage. Why is this important? I think we all can agree that it is. Many of us have horror stories of working in spaces where boundaries and consent were non-existent words. In the best cases, this style of work was uncomfortable. In the worst, it was activating and traumatic. As we continue to learn more about trauma-informed practices, one of the best things we can do for our ensembles is to discuss and honor boundaries and consent. And this, of course, ties into intimacy work for the stage. As a starting point for our document, I focused on boundaries and tools for developing a space where all who are involved can honor their boundaries. At the start of the production process, we can do a lot to establish a space where participants feel more secure to take risks by going through the boundary tools, letting our ensembles know it's okay to ask questions, normalizing no, and normalizing check-in questions before beginning work, especially work where there will be intimacy. These check-in questions are incredibly important as boundaries and consent can change throughout the process. It is important to keep the dialogue ongoing to make sure everyone feels comfortable moving through the process. Some of the boundary tools we focused on include buttons, fences, gates, the discomfort scale, the use of green, yellow, red zones, placeholders, and of course, the boundary practice. All of these are outlined in more detail in our document. We also wanted to include a brief overview on staging intimacy in our document. Theaters of all kinds, from community to high school and beyond, are staging scenes with intimate moments, so we felt that it was important to include a basic overview into the current working practices for approaching these scenes. There are so many great resources available about this topic, so one thing Amber and I discussed about this section of the document is we just wanted it to be a starting point so that people could continue to do further research. So in this section of our document, we included information on when to hire an intimacy director, the importance of desexualizing the language used during the rehearsal process, and the ingredients of intimacy, as described by Chelsea Pace in her book, Staging Sex. We also included some considerations for staging nudity and some alternative choices for intimacy that can be used if an actor is uncomfortable or if they're sick or for some other reason the intimate act cannot occur. While I feel that we have a lot of great information in this section, I know there is so much work to be done. One thing that I would like to expand upon as we continue to develop this document is the inclusion of best practices in regards to intimacy and boundaries for the entire production team. So thinking about how do our technicians fit in? How do our designers fit in? How do our stage managers fit in? I think we often focus on the actors, but if we could expand these practices to include the entire production team, the benefits would be incredible. That being said, it was a lot of fun to work on this section and we learned a lot. Thank you.
Hey there, everyone. Madison here talking about some conflict resolution as part of our trauma-informed practices project. I'm going to bring a couple models into the picture today, one of which we know very well. It's OARS. As we all remember from previously in this class, OARS is an acronym that we can use really at any part of any concern resolution process, which we'll get to in a moment. But as a refresher, OARS is open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizing. And ultimately, OARS is an attempt to rectify issues by first meeting the issue with full understanding. So it's a very helpful tool to always have in our back pocket. Now, a concern resolution path is originally created by the Chicago Theater Standards. So we've modeled all our work through a trauma-informed lens based on what the Chicago Theater Standards have done. And this is a 3-tiered process that sort of encourages different levels of escalation depending upon how difficult it might be to mitigate a harm or resolve a concern. There are 3 levels. They include people through from the initial people involved in the concern or the moment of harm, all the way up to the artistic director, the managing director, the members of the board, and subsequently sort of legal teams that might need to be prepared for really high levels of escalation that need to be addressed at the highest of levels. So it's a really helpful model that kind of standardizes a workflow of sorts for any concerns that an organization may face. And so is thus very valuable because everyone sort of understands across the organization, or should understand if executed correctly, how issues will be dealt with should issues arrive. And this makes everyone in the process hypothetically feel far more supported should something happen that they feel the need to address or report. For ease, I've sort of included a breakdown of how we at my institution at OU, how we've taken a concern resolution path and modeled it through some of this work right here to best suit our institution. And this is ultimately an offer, but also a reminder that we can customize these sorts of things to best suit the spaces that we are in through a trauma-informed lens, because these are guidelines that are a little broad depending upon what any institution might need, because all of our institutions have different levels of resources and needs. The last thing I want to include is a clearing conversation, because ultimately a clearing conversation is an attempt to clear the air of any major problem or even minor problem. But when we research on conflict resolution, we often see tools provided for the victim of sorts to approach someone with a concern or a harm that they are navigating. That's not always true, but that is usually the case. In a clearing conversation, both parties are sort of equally empowered to address a harm theoretically as early in the process as possible. For example, if I'm worried I upset you, I can say, hey, this thing that I said earlier, I worry that might have impacted you negatively.
Hey, this is Brian Gronkowski, and I am bringing you practices for the end of rehearsals. The ends of rehearsals are times of transition. De-rolling exercises are designed to help theater makers transition from the rehearsal space or studio space back into reality. Debriefing practices are designed to help theater makers transition from rehearsal to rehearsal or production to production. What is de-rolling? De-rolling is the action of a performer separating from the character physically, emotionally, and/or spiritually following a rehearsal or performance. Performers may carry the character's tension in their body and need ways to release the physical stress. Performers may feel the weight of their character's emotions. There may be strong subject matter that can affect any member of the production. For these reasons, theater makers need tools to help emotionally transition from rehearsal spaces back into their lives and leave their dramatic work in the theater. De-rolling practices are not a one-size-fits-all. There are going to be different demands for every role in every show. De-rolling from the role of Etta Gabler may be very different than de-rolling as Tree Number 3 in The Wizard of Oz. The goal is for theater makers to have a toolkit of exercises to choose. In the resources document we are sharing with you, there are a list of de-rolling exercises such as the step out used in the Alba technique, removing makeup in a purposeful way, and crossing lines raising curtains, and many more. De-rolling exercises do not have to be complicated. Deep, focused breathing combined with stretches and focused meditations can help everyone with the transition from rehearsal to reality. Debriefing is the reflection piece of the production process where all members of the theater company reflect on what worked, what needs attention, and set a plan for the next rehearsal or production. Debriefing can take place at the end of each rehearsal and may include snaps, little affirmations given to each other at the ends of rehearsals, or may include a more organized conversation. Debriefing also occurs at the end of the production process. This might also be called a postmortem. Additional resources and ideas for debriefing are in the document we shared. Thank you.
These recommendations reflect the current environment of 2023 and should be considered a living document meant to be revisited and reevaluated as the theatrical landscape changes and evolves. Pre-production. We supplied some recommendations and questions to ask when planning your season, selecting plays, directors, and creative team members. We recommend that you should identify not only what characteristics you are looking for in the roles you are casting, but what kind of person you want in the rehearsal room. This is another step to ensure a welcoming, non-judgmental, trauma-informed environment. Regarding notices and disclosures, we highlight the use of language such as actively seeking actors of all genders, ethnicities, and body types, and content disclosures like, please note, Head Over Heels is a complex show that covers a range of social and emotional content such as love, sex, sexuality, and gender, to name just a few. We recommend providing materials ahead of auditions and/or callbacks when applicable. And if you are truly seeking actors of all genders, ethnicities, body types, make sure that the space you are holding your auditions in is accessible to all. Audition forms should be also inclusive with preferred names and pronouns asked. For your first rehearsal, we go over some of the information that we shared earlier in this presentation, including the electing of a deputy, and bring in an outside trauma-informed therapist to discuss the topics and themes discussed in the show. This person should have received a copy of the script in advance and had initial meetings with a director and/or creative team. When searching for the right individual, prior theater experience is a huge plus. Have an open dialogue with actors to get their ideas on how best to utilize rehearsal time in the scenes dealing with the identified content, and find out what self-care they may need during a rehearsal. Set aside rehearsals for trauma-informed therapist or topic specialist check-ins. Posting of glimmer menus, code of conduct, and professional resources throughout the space, including but not limited to the following: rehearsal room, green room, dressing room, shops, backstage, and call boards. Post-production. Approximately 1 to 2 weeks after the production, a postmortem meeting should occur for check-ins with the participants and a chance for all involved to discuss what went right and what didn't regarding the process, including any trauma-informed practices. The trauma-informed therapist should be at the postmortem, but if they cannot be there, a follow-up between the director and stage manager and therapist should be scheduled. Audience resources. Create guidelines for audience behavior, such as a code of conduct, and make sure it is posted on your website, at the box office, and entrances to the theater. Embolden your house management team to familiarize themselves with this code of conduct and remove audience members not adhering to them. Content advisories. Review and update the content advisories you discovered during pre-production, along with any production warnings such as strobe lights, gunshots, etc. These advisories should be made public before tickets go on sale and posted in numerous locations, which we include in the document. Share the professional resources that you gathered with the audience. Put them on your website, in programs, restrooms, bars, merchandise stands, etc. Be creative. Display the information in places frequently visited by your guests, including bathroom stalls like Oregon Shakespeare Festival does. Engaging with your community and potential audiences in advance of productions with programming surrounding the themes, topics, or issues in your show provides a great way to expand your organization's community involvement, helps educate on the topic, and helps to build interest in your production. Hold workshops or seminars in advance of your production's run or scheduled during the run separate from performances. Similar to workshops and seminars, hold an event before the show for audiences to ease into the themes and topics discussed in the show. This helps the audience prepare for the piece they are about to see, as well as engage in discourse surrounding it. Consider talkbacks about the content of the production in addition to or in lieu of actor talkbacks. The talkback may also be helpful for shows that are considered problematic or for content that is not fully addressed in the production.